we are on Samach Beis Amid Aleph 62a, the last couple of lines of the page. The Gemara is analyzing the arguments the Gemara had made earlier in a brisa as to whether we should compare somebody who is a uncircumcised who was included in the korban during one of the parts of the service, and should we compare it to a tuma, somebody who was tamei, who was included in the korban, versus should we compare it to someone who had intent to eat the korban at the wrong time? Now, if we compare it to having eaten it the wrong time, then it's going to be invalid. If we compare it to somebody who has eaten, who's including someone who is uncircumcised in the korban, in the group, that is somebody who, if we compare it to someone who's tamei, so then that's kosher, so this will also be kosher. So the Gemara made various comparisons. So one comparison it made was just as in tuma. There's partial tuma, and so too over here. So the Gemara wanted to prove from that partial tuma means that that part of the group is tamei and part's not. And the Gemara says no, a partial tuma means that the meat some of it became tamei, some and not. So now the Gemara is going to try and look at the second argument and see whether that's true, whether we can prove or disprove this idea that we're talking about the meat becoming tamei and not that the person who brought the korban is tamei. So this is the third to last line, the last word of 62b, Samach Beis, Amid Beis. But Mayokimta. So what did you explain as the meaning of this brisa? But Tumas Basar, that the meat itself had become tamei. Ema Sefer. So let's see the end of this discussion. Let's compare two things that don't have any scenario within which they are permissible. Two prohibitions that are not permissible. Whereas tuma, there is a permissible scenario where if somebody is tamei, he's allowed to bring the korban pesach if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei. So there is a scenario that that this prohibition is permissible, whereas there is no scenario that someone's uncircumcised is permissible to bring the korban pesach or eat the korban pesach, and also there's no scenario where if something was intended to be outside of to eat beyond the time, that'll be permissible. So let's compare those two because those are actually comparable. So and therefore don't compare it to tuma because it is permissible in a case. Now, so now we turn to Samach Beis and we say the Gemara says, in what way is it stronger? In which way are we saying that tuma has a permissible case? So the Gemara is responding to what the Gemara had said earlier. You just said that we're talking about not that the person is tamei, but the meat is tamei. In which case is it permissible to eat meat that's tamei? In general, we say that if the people are tamei, that the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei, you can bring the korban that way. But if the majority of meat's tamei, then you can't eat the korban that way. So in which case is it permissible? Elapshita, but Gabri must be that we're talking about the people are tamei. And in which case is it permissible? But tzibor, when the majority of the community is tamei. So Reisha b'tumas basar. So the first argument that we had discussed is talking about when the meat is tamei. The meat is impure. Sefer b'tumas gabri, and the second argument is in regards to the people being tamei. So the Gemara says yes, that's a fine enough argument because shame tuma kaparach, because they're both in the concept of tuma, they're both in the halachic terms of tuma, of spiritual impurity. So it doesn't make a difference whether it's talking about the person's impurity or the animal's impurity. Either way, it's going to be about tuma. And we compare, and we're saying that the concept of tuma is different than the concept of being uncircumcised. Or perhaps kula b'tumas basar. It's all really talking about even the meat is tamei. In which case is it permissible, even though that generally it's prohibited to eat kachim, a korban, an offering that had become tamei, you're not allowed to eat it. In which case, is it permissible? But Tumas Pesach. In the Tumah of a carbon Pesach, because that is actually the requirement of the Pesach, and the purpose of the carbon is in order to eat it. The Tanan, as we learned, Pesach Abba Tumah, Necha B'Tumah. And the carbon that the Pesach that's brought when the majority of the community is tamei, it's not only brought, but it's actually eaten as well. And the reason is because that's the purpose of the carbon. That's the entirety of the carbon, or the structure of the carbon, is that it should be eaten by the people bringing it. Because it comes with the intent or the purpose of it being eaten. Masav Rav Huna Bereder Rav Yeshua. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, asked a question. Up until now, we were talking about a carbon Pesach that you brought it on the 14th day of Nisan, which is the time that you're supposed to bring the carbon Pesach, and on that day you're bringing it with the intent of being a Pesach. That's the correct intent. If you intend to bring it for the group that are designated to it, so that's the correct intent. And these are people that are allowed to and able to eat the carbon. If, however, you brought it for the wrong group, that's a shinui bailim, a change in the owner, or people that can't eat it for whatever reason, as we saw, or you have the wrong intent, you intend for it to be another carbon, another offering, not the one that it's designated as a Pesach. So those would be invalidations for Pesach. Now, this is an invalidation specifically for Pesach. Other karbanos don't necessarily become invalid if you have the wrong intent for what carbon it is. So you thought it was something else, that it won't work for the owner, it won't fulfill their obligation, but it could still be a kosher carbon. So ha-Pesach, she'avra shnas. Now, carbon Pesach, one of the requirements is that it has to be within its first year, a lamb, a goat, within the first year of its life. Now, this person is bringing a carbon Pesach when he designated it. Perhaps it was still within its first year, but by the time he's bringing it, it actually is beyond the 12 months of its life. So Sha'avr Shnaseh, the year has passed, V'shachta bismanei l'shmai, and he brought it on the 14th day, meaning the day that he's supposed to bring it, with the intent of it being a carbon Pesach, so it's the correct intent, but it's invalid on account of that it's too old. Similarly, Hashechet acherim l'shem Pesach bismanei, or if he brings another carbon, he brings a shalamim, which is the general family of a carbon Pesach, and he brings the shalamim with the intent of it being a Pesach, which is a specified type of shalamim, peace offering. So that he brought a general peace offering for the specified Pesach offering, bismani, but he brought it on the correct time. So it's on Erev Pesach, and instead of bringing an animal that was designated as a Pesach, he brings an animal that was designated as a shalamim, which is the general rule, the general family of this carbon. So Rabbi Eliezer says invalid. Rabbi Yeshua machshem. Rabbi Yeshua says it will count as a valid carbon. Taimad bismani. And the reason is because he brought it on the 14th in the afternoon. And since he brought it in the 14th in the afternoon, which is the time that the carbon Pesach is supposed to be brought, so it's going to count as a valid carbon. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says that the reason that it's not going to be valid, because he says, look, the carbon Pesach is in the general family of shalamim. It's in the general family of peace offerings. And therefore, all year round, besides for the 14th in the afternoon, when you're supposed to bring the carbon Pesach, if you brought it, it's supposed to be, if you bring it as a carbon, it's supposed to be brought as a shalamim, as something else. Yet, if you bring it on this day, on Erev Pesach, the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon, when you're supposed to bring it a Pesach, and it is designated as a Pesach, and you bring it in as a shlamim, as the general family of the peace offering, it's going to be invalid. For sure, something that is not designated as a Pesach, it's a general family, which never turns into a Pesach, for sure it should be invalid. In other words, his argument is the Pesach can turn into a shalamim when it's not on the correct date. And yet, today, if you brought it as something else, it wouldn't count. So the shalamim the peace offering, which cannot turn into a Pesach if it was designated as the general family. You can't turn it into a specified Pesach. So then for sure today, if you brought it for not its own designation, it's not going to be valid. Rabbi Yeshua, however, says no, it will be valid, because the general rule is, as we said, that generally if you bring a carbon not for the correct designation, so it was brought as it was intended, it was designated as a carbon A, and you bring it with the intent of it being carbon B, it's still going to be kosher. The only ones that don't work that way are a chatas, a sin offering, has to be brought and designated and brought as a sin offering, otherwise it won't be kosher, and the carbon Pesach. So a general carbon, say a general carbon, it will be kosher if it's brought without its intent. So we can say a kal v'chomer. We can say a logical argument like this. A carbon Pesach outside of its time, meaning all year round, where you can't bring a Pesach on Hanukkah. So if you bring it, you have to bring it as something not as its designation. You have to bring, even though it was designated as a Pesach offering, you have to bring it as a shalomim. Meaning if you brought it as a Pesach in Hanukkah, it's not going to be valid. Yet other things that if you brought as a Pesach will be kosher. That means you had designated a chatas, a ola, an ascent offering, and somebody brought it as a Pesach, or you had designated a Thanksgiving offering, a toda, and it was brought as a Pesach. It's going to be kosher because as we said, all other karbanos, if you brought it for the wrong designation, it won't work. It won't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but it'll be a valid karban. So a toda, let's say a Thanksgiving offering, which is sort of like a first cousin to a Pesach offering, they're both part of the general top family of Thanksgiving of peace offerings. And Pesach is really related because it is also a Thanksgiving offering. Thanks for coming out of Mitzrayim, and so they're related. And you bring the carbon, if you brought it toda, for instance, this Thanksgiving offering, and while the Kohen is bringing it, he intends it as a Pesach. As long as it's the 14th day of Nisan, it's going to be valid. So then for sure, when you bring it for its own designation, then it's going to be for sure valid. And this is all explained in the Gemara in Zvachim 11. So the Gemara says, based on this, time of Bezmanim, and the reason is because it was brought on the 14th day in the afternoon. And since on the 14th day in the afternoon, we're going to say it's going to be valid, hashaleh bezmanei kosher. But if you brought it all year round where the Pesach is not a Pesach, the Pesach is really meant to be a shalomim. So even Rabbi Eliezer is going to say it's going to be valid. And because Rabbi Eliezer agrees to Rabbi Yeshua that if it's not in the correct time, then it's going other karbanos brought for its name are going to as a Pesach are going to be kosher, because as we said, in all other karbanos besides for a chatas offering, there is no invalidation of bringing something not for its own intent. It won't work for fulfilling the obligation of the owner, but it'll be a valid karban. So since we see that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond to Rabbi Yeshua about that, we see that obviously any karban brought all year round for the sake of a Pesach is going to be valid, because you can bring another karban in the name of something else and it'll still be valid. However, Rabbi Eliezer says if it's the 14th day of Nisan, that's when it's going to be invalid. So now the Gemara is going to challenge that and say, wait, why is that? Va'amai, Neimahayim. We just said earlier, and this we saw yesterday morning in the Gemara that there was a machlokas between Rav Chisda and Rabbah, but everybody agreed to be strict. We would say the concept of hayil, even though right now the scenario is not something that should be be prohibited or valid. If there's another scenario that we could create for this to be valid, it would be okay. And then earlier he said that since somebody that is not circumcised right now is not a part of the korban, but if he wanted to, he could make it and make himself, he can circumcise himself and make himself a part of the korban Pesach. So that would count as a valid participation and someone who can participate in the korban, and it'll count. So if we say Hoyel, so say the same here. Let's say since since if it was the 14th day in the afternoon, it would make it invalid. So that any time in the year as well, it should make it invalid, because if we just wait and do it on the 14th, it's going to be invalid. So we have a scenario to make it invalid. So make it invalid now as well. So Eric, we're now about 15 lines in on Samach Beis Amid Beis 62b, and the second word of the line is Amar of Papa. So Amar of Papa, Shani Hasan. No, there's a specific teaching. The Amar Krav Amartim Zevach Pesach. Who Bava Yossi. The korban Pesach is going to require that it has to be made as a korban Pesach, and then it's the Pesach. Hu Bava Yossi. It is as is. Lo yehu l'shem acherim. A korban Pesach cannot be brought in the name of anything else. V'lo acherim l'shmayin. Other things cannot be brought in its name. However, that's only bismanai. Shu pasul l'shem acherim psulim l'shmayin. That's only in on the 14th day. When you bring the korban Pesach as anything else, it's going to be invalid. So therefore, anything else in its name will also be invalid. Shalom bismanai. But all year round, you're actually not supposed to bring it as a Pesach. So when the Torah says it is a Pesach, it doesn't mean any time in the year. It only means specifically on the 14th, because actually the rest of the year, you're supposed to not bring it as its designation as a Pesach. You're supposed to bring it as a Shalomim, as the general category, because you can't bring a Pesach on Hanukkah or Purim or Tu B'Shvat. So therefore, if the statement of the Torah that the Pesach must be as is only true for the 14th. The rest of the year, if you bring a Pesach, you have to bring it with intention for it to be a Shalomim. So therefore, so therefore, other things also will be kosher in its. That's the conclusion of this section of understanding the Brisa and the arguments of whether or not something is a korban Pesach that's brought with the intent of another korban, or a different, or some people that are valid, some are not. And we're going to get back to that shortly about if you brought the korban for some people that are circumcised and some are not, in which way it will be invalid or valid. In the meantime, the Gemara tells a story. Rav Samlai, also coming to Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Samlai came before Rabbi Yochanan, and it seems that Rabbi Yochanan did not know that he was a Torah scholar. Amalei Nisan Limar Sefer Yuksei. He said, "Teacher, can you please teach me the meaning of the lineages, the Brisa teachings, the halachic teachings of the lineages within the Torah?" So this is in the book of Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, where in Divrei Hayamim the Torah gives a lot of names and of different people and their lineage and the halachic ramifications, and so many are important. So he said, "Can you teach me the meaning of Yuchsit?" Amalei Mehechana. He said, "Where are you from?" Before he was willing to teach him, he asked him where he's from. Amalei Milud. I originally come from place Lud. Vehechan Motzava. And where do you live now? Ben Hardai. I live in Babylon and Bavel in the Hardai, where Shmuel was the head of the academy. Amalei Ein Nidonim Lo Leludim Lo Nardaim. I'm sorry, we cannot teach the teachings of this book of Yuchsin to anybody that's from Lud, because that's in the south, or anybody from Babylon. And so for you in the Hardai. And there were reasons for this, either because there were a lot of the idea of Yuchsin was to talk about the lineages, to make sure that everybody has proper lineage, and there are no questions about their connection to their Judaism or in some improper mixing in the families. But what happened in Bavel, there were places that there were problems, and there were families that had that had questionable status that were mixed into those families, and so they didn't teach to them, either not to embarrass them or because they weren't worthy of learning these ideas. So and he said to him, for sure I can't teach you that milud. You've got a double strike, 2 strikes against you, because you're from Lud, from the south, and you're living in Babylon in Arda. Kafye the artsy. But he begged him and he pushed and finally he was willing. Amalei nisibigim yachid. So now he pressed his luck. He said, okay, you're willing to teach me. Now teach it to me all in 3 months. Shaka kala pasakbe. So he took a clump of clay and tossed it behind him and said, Amalei said to him, my Bruria, the bit of the Rabbi Meir. Bruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir. Brate the Rabbi Chanina ben Tradya, who was the daughter of Rabbi Chanina ben Tradya. The wife of a great scholar, the daughter of a great scholar, the Tanya Tlasmei Shmaita B'Yoma, and she was taught and she learned these brises, these halachas regarding yuchsin, regarding lineages. 300 teachings per day, Migimel Meir Avasa, from 300 teachers. And yet she could not fulfill the knowledge and understanding of all of these teachings. But Lashnin in 3 years. And you want to learn it in 3 months? You think you're going to be able to do better than Bruria? So Rabbi Yochanan turned away. He was going to leave. Kishakav Azal, as Rabbi Yochanan was turning away to leave, Amalei. So Rabbi Samlai asked him another question. He said to him, Rabbi, why is it that in the first Mishnah that we have learned in this parak, in this chapter, it said that if you intended this korban to be both, first you said it should be a korban Pesach, and then said it should be brought as a shalamin. That's invalid. Whereas in the next Mishnah it says if you intended for people that can eat, meaning people that have the ability to eat, they're not too young or too old, and then you intended for people that cannot eat, why there it's going to be valid. So what's the difference? Why is it that in one, if you have a mix between kosher and non-kosher, meaning intention as a korban Pesach and then intending for something else, it's going to be invalid? Or where you intend for people that can eat and then people that cannot eat, it's going to be invalid. Amar Le, he said, hey, wait, I didn't realize that you're a scholar. I see that you are a student of the academies and you're a Tzuvim Rabbanan. Come, let me explain it to you. The first invalidation, which is about the intent of what type of korban it is, that you first intend it's a Pesach and then it's a Shalomim. So there, the invalidation is in the body of the korban itself. Therefore, it's invalid. But when you're talking about who can eat it, and you first thought about people that can and then people that can't, it's not an invalidation in the korban itself. Intending whether it's a Pesach or something else, you cannot separate out where it's invalid or valid. It's clear. It's intermingled in the whole thing. But when you intend part for people that can eat and part not, in any case, not every person is going to eat the entire korban. Everybody that you intend in the group is going to eat a small portion. So I can separate out and say, here are the sections that go to the people that can eat, and that's going to be valid. And here are the sections that can go to people that cannot eat. And now, since the people that can eat need to eat a kazayas, at least an olive size, and that needs to be shechted, right? The animal needs to be slaughtered in a proper halachic manner. So then the shechita that works for them works for the whole animal, and so therefore it's going to be valid. And so therefore it's going to be kosher, right? Because you can separate out for who it's needed. Another distinction, when it's for the intent of the people that can for the korban Pesach as well as non-korban Pesach, that's an invalidation that works in any of the 4 parts of the service: the shechting, the receiving the blood, the bringing it, and the spritzing it on the mizbeach on the altar. However, That's not invalid by all four parts. It's only because it's about eating. So that's only by the shechita, which is necessary for the eating. Another distinction: the invalidation of the wrong intent of the carbon, that's invalid both in a communal and an individual's carbon. Whereas the intent of the people that can't eat it or can eat it, that's only invalidation by an individual carbon. It's not invalid by a communal carbon. Rav Ashi says, however, some of the distinctions are not seem to be repetitive. The invalidation is in the animal versus that you cannot separate out the parts is really one and the same, meaning the invalidation is about the whole of the animal. In any case, it's all Milsi, the matam what's the reason that the invalidation is in the entire body? Because you cannot separate out at one part from the next. In any case, he explained to him these four distinctions between the first Mishnah and the second Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Bar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Bar Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, from the day that the teachings about the family lineages and the meanings were lost to either the shorthand teachings were lost or the knowledge of meaning about it was lost. The strength of the scholars were weakened. The kamer and the illumination of their eyes darkened. Amar Mazuta ben Atzel la'Atzel te'inu dalad me'agam the darshi. They're between two statements about Atzel and Eitzel and Atzel, which is in the name of a family, and there's a lineage there. Just about that section in the first Divrei Hayamim Chronicles 8 Pasuk chapter 8 and 9. There's just on that section there were so many teachings enough that if you wrote it down, 400 camels can carry. It would take 400 camels to carry the teaching. Obviously, it's a guzma. It's an exaggeration, but the idea is that there's so much teaching about this that is important and was lost. Back to the idea of mulin and loy mulin and ein mulin. We're going to have the machlokas that we had earlier. We've seen a few times already that according to Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, there's a machlokas in if somebody says, I designate this animal as a korban, but he specifies first this should be in place of an olah, and then he says it should be in place of a chatas. So Rabbi Meir says, whatever he first said, that's what takes hold. Rabbi Yossi says no, that it becomes both because this first statement and the second statement are to be taken. So you have a initial and a second. Now there's a machlokas between Abai and Rava in the Gemara in Zavach. What is the meaning? What would be the halacha in regards to if somebody specifies explicitly and says, I want half of it to be one korban and half to be another. Now we understand the reasoning of Rabbi Meir, who said that you only take the first statement into account, is that because we don't know that it looks like a retraction, and we don't know that he meant from the start for it to be both, and therefore the first statement alone is valid. But if we clearly know that he's saying, I want it to be half this and half that, so therefore he meant both, and both do take effect. That's the opinion of Abaye, and therefore it's going to work. Whereas Rava says it's not like it's a retraction. It's just that once the first statement took effect, nothing else can take effect. So even if you said half of this should be an olah, as soon as he says that, the statement is now effective on the whole animal. So even though he meant and said that it should also be echatas, it no longer has anywhere to take effect because the animal already became an ola. And therefore he says, even if he explicitly says I want half to be ola and half to be chatas, only the first statement is going to be valid. This is all relevant to understanding the next Gemara. So the Gemara wants to bring proof to this. And the basis of the argument of Rava and Abaye is going to come down to a concept of Yeshna l'shchita metchila v'ad sof. Do we say that the entire process of shechting the animal is one entire entity, all a part of the service of shechting the animal, and therefore, if this person had intent during one part of shechita for it to be an olah, and then the next part of shechita for it to be a shalamim or a chatas, they actually both take effect because each one is another part of the service. Whereas that's the meaning of Abaye. Whereas Rava says no, that the shechita only takes effect at the end. And since it only takes effect at the end, the completion of the shechting is the effective moment. And at that moment, only one of the statements can take effect. And that's the meaning of the meaning of this machlokes in Abaye and Rava. And so based on this, the Gemara is going to explain this brisa. Tanya, we learned acherim omri. Acherim is another term for Rabbi Meir. Others say is a reference to Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir says, Hiktim mulim la'arelim. If he first intended that this carbon should be for people that are circumcised, and then included uncircumcised people, kosher, it's going to be kosher. Arelim lemulim. But if he first intended for it to be for circumcised people, uncircumcised people, and which is invalid, and then for people that did have a bris, puzzle, it's going to be invalid because it was already invalid. So mashna mulim la'arelim the kosher the kula are labi'inan. Why? The Gemara asks, what's the reason? Shouldn't we say the first section tells us that if you intended for people that had a bris and then people that didn't have a bris, we're going to say, well, it's not completely uncircumcised people, so it's going to be kosher. So too in the second section, in the second part, so too in the second part, we should say, look, you need it to be, in order for it to be invalid, it has to be that all people in this group are never had a bris. But if some had a bris, that should be enough. And who cares if that was your first thought or your second thought? So now we turn to Samach Gimel Amid Aleph. We're on the 63a at the top. Lema Kasavri Achim. So we're going to have to say that Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that shechita only takes effect at the end of the shechting process. And at that moment, you can only have one thought, and that thought is the one that's going to be effective. And like Rava said, as we just explained in the introduction to this section, that Rava is of the opinion the reason why it's going to be invalid, even if according to Rabbi Meir, even if the person intended, I want half of it to be an ola and half a shlamim, he explicitly says half. Nevertheless, it's entirely going to be invalid. It's entirely going to be whatever his first thought was, because that first thought is what takes effect. And as we explained, the reason is because Rav is of the opinion that the shechita only takes effect at the last moment, and whatever intent he has at that moment is what is effective. And so there's no time for two thoughts to happen. As Rav explained, that even in a case where he explicitly said, I want half ola, half shlamim, it's still going to be a disagreement, and it's all going to be invalid. So therefore, if you first thought of it to be for people that had a bris, so then it's valid because that's the thought that's effective. Because it doesn't take effect there's no thought. It doesn't actually, the intent in regards to the people that didn't have a bris is non-effective. However, if he first thought about the people that did not have a bris, So the arelim chayli. So that's what's effective. The people, the intent about the people that did not have a bris, and that's going to be an invalid korban pesach mulan lechayli, because the intent about the people that were circumcised, that had a bris, is not going to count. Amar Rava. So Rava or Rabba said, look, really we could explain like Abaye that really Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that the shechita is an entire process, and throughout whatever intent you have during the process of shechita is going to take effect. And so both of these should take effect. However, over here, he intended in his heart that he's bringing it for both of these. Both for all people that are in the group, regardless of whether they had a bris or not. However, but he only uttered for people that were did not have a bris, and didn't end up saying the people that had a bris until such time that the shechita was done. So the basis of the machlokes is on this. The Rabbi Meir Rabbi Meir says it doesn't require that what you utter is the same as your intent, and therefore it's going to be okay. And therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, the mouth, your intent of your heart and your mouth don't have to be the same, and so whatever you said is effective, even though that's only part of what you intended, and so it's going to be invalid. The Chachamim say no. Whatever your mouth and your heart have to be symmetrical. They have to go together. It has to go together, and therefore, you need pivot liba shavit. It has to be that they are that they go work together. Your heart and your whatever you stated. And so when he said Arael for the uncircumcised, he meant what it was in the heart as well. Now the Gemara challenges that. Is that really true? Is Rabbi Meir really of the opinion that you don't require the statement to parallel and concur with what's in the heart? For a minute, we have a contradiction to that. Somebody intended to say this should be teruma, which is the first tithe, 2% that goes to the Kohen. And he said instead it's meiser, it should be a tithe, 10% that goes to the Levi. Or meiser v'matruma, or vice versa. He made an oath. He says, I swear I will not walk into this house. And he pointed to the wrong house. He said the wrong house. He said the wrong number. He meant another one. Or I prohibit benefit from this person. And he said the wrong name. He said somebody else. He didn't. It doesn't count. It's not a effective utterance. Until both what he says and what was his intent are combined, are work together, are similar. Elam Abaya. So Abaya has a different interpretation. Rather, Abaya says, as we explained earlier in the introduction, that if you hold Yeshna l'shchita metchila batzot, that there's a shchita process is not at the moment that it's complete, but the entire process is a part of the slaughtering and shchita. So while there are two simanim, there are two parts that have to be slaughtered by an animal: the trachea and the esophagus, the kana and the vesha. While he was shechting one, he had intent that I'm bringing this for these people that are circumcised, that had a bris. And while he's doing the second siman, the second part, is intending I'm also bringing the korban for these people that are uncircumcised, that never had a bris. The besiman sheni nami b'sicha b'mulin, but that includes in the second siman also the people that did have a bris, because he said also for people that are uncircumcised. So everybody's included. Seifim, however, the second halacha is talking about the Amas Siman Rishon La'arelim. We said the first siman is for while shechting one siman, one of the two parts that need to be shechted, he had intent for people that were uncircumcised, that didn't have a bris. And then later says also for the other people, but it's too late, because that one siman that part was already done exclusively for people that are not circumcised, that don't have a bris. It was exclusively for people that didn't have a bris. And this is Rabbi Meir, as we explained in the introduction. Rabbi Meir says that even if part of the shechita is going to be invalid, it's going to count as a complete invalid action, and that's the basis of which Rava explained his teaching of Rava and Abaye explained their teaching of Rabbi Meir, as we explained in the introduction. And this is and so to over here, this is going to count as an individual act or an isolated act of the shechting of one of the parts of shechita that's necessary for shechita. And since at that point he had the intent for it to be only for people that did not have bris, it's going to not count as a valid korban. The Chachamim who disagree, they say no, you cannot invalidate a korban with the intent that you have during one part of the shechita. It would have to be the entirety. We look at the entirety of the action. The Mishnah continues. Hashoged as a Pesach al chametz. Somebody shechts a korban Pesach, but he does so as while he's in possession of chametz, which is prohibited, as we read. Really, the Torah says, "L'sishchat al chametz dam zivki." Do not slaughter, do not shecht upon chametz the korban Pesach. So over below says he transgresses the Torah prohibition. Rabbi Yehuda says not only the korban Pesach, but even prior to the korban Pesach, you have to bring the last steady offering that comes every day, that the offering of the afternoon tamid. That too has to be already brought. Has to be brought when you already don't have chametz in possession. So if you have chametz in possession at that point, you're also transgressing. Rabbi Shimon says if you bring the korban Pesach on the 14th in the afternoon as a korban Pesach, that's when you're going to transgress for having chametz in possession. But if you brought it with the wrong intent as some other korban, you're not going to transgress. If you brought any other korban, to say you brought a shlamim or a toda, a peace offering or a thanksgiving offering, whether you brought it bein lishman, bein shalei lishman, whether you brought it for itself or you brought it as a Pesach, pater, it's going to be invalid because pater, you're going to be exempt because there's no need to not have chametz for that. Uvamayed, and if you bring it on within Pesach itself, and so if you brought it as a korban Pesach and you had chametz, so since it's not valid to bring in korban Pesach in Yontif itself, because that's not a part of the obligation anymore, right? So therefore, even if you have chametz, you're not supposed to have chametz, and you'll have another transgression, but you will not transgress bringing the korban Pesach on chametz because it's actually not a valid korban Pesach at that point. But if you brought it as a shlamim, which would be valid, as we talked about multiple times now, that a korban Pesach, even though that you donated it and designated it as a korban Pesach, if it's not on the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon, meaning it's not the day you're supposed to bring the korban Pesach, so then it's brought as the general family term of a peace offering of a shlamim. And so if the rest of on Pesach, if you bring this not as a Pesach, you bring it as a shlamim, so that's actually the correct way to bring it that day. That so then you're going to transgress because you have chametz, so you're not supposed to bring it with chametz. And all other karbanos, which are going to be a valid karban at this point on Pesach, and you have chametz, you're going to transgress. So it's not only a karban Pesach, but any other karban that you bring that counts as a valid karban is going to be chayiv. Chutz min hachatas, besides for a chatas, sheshachta shaloi l'shmoi, that you brought not for the intent of chatas, as we said earlier, the two types of karban that you would bring, not for its own designation, that are invalid or a Pesach on the 14th day and of Nisan, and the Chatas anytime. So the concept of Rabbi Shimon, what he's saying is that there's a concept of shchita ru'uya. The shechting of this animal is appropriate. It was done correctly. If it's done correctly, meaning it's a valid korban, so that if you have chametz on Pesach, you're gonna transgress the prohibition. However, if it's invalid for some reason, then it's not going to. You're not going to transgress, and that's all of these scenarios. That if it's valid because it's a korban Pesach on the 14th, or a korban Pesach for the sake of a shalom and peace offering on the 15th, 16th, 17th, and any other day, so then it's going to count as a valid korban, and you're not allowed to have chametz on Pesach, and you do, you're going to transgress. So we'll leave it at that, and tomorrow morning, Bez Hashem, we'll continue with the analysis of this mission.